I remember encountering the apologetics of David Wood almost 15 years ago when I was a Christian myself. At that time, I admired David's boldness and conviction in defending the Christian faith. Now that I'm on the other side of the aisle, though, while I maintain that one can admire the assuredness with which he attempts to justify what he believes, his overconfidence can actually get in his way, and I'm afraid I don't find most of his arguments to be all that convincing or cogent. Case in point, David's defense of the resurrection of Jesus. Because I personally find the resurrection of Jesus such a fascinating topic to discuss, and because it's the foundation of the Christian faith, I always enjoy surveying an apologist's case for the veracity of this supposedly historical event. Unfortunately, David Wood's case for the resurrection leaves much to be desired. It's one of the weakest cases I've ever surveyed. To begin with, David seems to ground his entire case for the resurrection on a measly 2 propositions.
Knowing that Jesus rose from the dead is actually much simpler than many people realize. To know that Jesus rose from the dead, we only need to know 2 things. 1, that he was really dead, and 2, that he was alive again later.
This is an odd way of presenting the case for the resurrection. David says that the way to know Jesus rose from the dead is to know 1, that Jesus died, and 2, that Jesus was alive again later. But that's exactly what a resurrection is, namely someone dying and raising back to life. That is to say, propositions 1 and 2 in conjunction just are what it means to know that someone rose from the dead in the first place. This entails that David's claim is that the way to know Jesus rose from the dead is to know that Jesus rose from the dead. Obviously, David's not wrong analytically, but it's an idiosyncratic and an altogether redundantly clumsy way to state the case for the resurrection. Moreover, since pretty much any informed aficionado of New Testament history is going to affirm that Jesus died, it would appear that the entirety of David's justification for the resurrection is encased in his second proposition, that Jesus was alive again after his death. So let's survey how David attempts to justify this incredibly loaded proposition.
How would we know if Jesus was alive at some point following his execution by the Romans? The same way we know many other things from history. We need witnesses, and we need to know that we can trust these witnesses.
David is making a fallacious inference here, and it's actually a mistaken inference commonly promulgated by apologists who argue for the resurrection using what's known as the maximal facts case. That is, apologists of this ilk usually believe that if they can demonstrate that the Gospels are reliable historical documents which are the product of reliable eyewitnesses, then whatever is contained within those documents, i.e. the resurrection narratives, is thereby historically vindicated. While this might sound reasonable on its face, it's not at all sound historical epistemology. Historical texts are not simply placed into a binary category of unreliable and reliable. Historical reliability is not an either-or, it's a spectrum. Some historians and some eyewitnesses are more or less reliable than others. Even the most unreliable historian is not completely disregarded, and even the most reliable historian does not record completely sober history. And these sentiments are even more applicable with regards to historians of antiquity, where accounts were usually sourced from oral traditions and hearsay. To quickly dive into just a few examples, Thucydides is considered the most reliable historian of antiquity. He was known for his impartiality, critically evaluating his sources, which he preferred to be comprised of eyewitnesses, and doing his best to avoid legendary exaggerations and myth. Thucydides even criticized his fellow historians who, as he put it, embellished their accounts for entertainment. He preferred to focus on contemporary events where he could verify accounts through reliable witnesses. Nevertheless, even holding the torch as the most reliable historian of antiquity doesn't thereby equate one with wholesale veridical history. Some events that Thucydides records, such as events in the Trojan War, incorporated some mix of myth and exaggeration, though Thucydides did a noble job of stripping away as much extraneous legend as he could. He also records a legendary curse on the Alcmaeonid family that influenced certain subsequent political events. So, even Thucydides, the most reliable historian of antiquity, cannot be 100% trusted in everything that he records. Tacitus is another reliable historian of antiquity. He was, like Thucydides, incredibly meticulous and critical and prioritized eyewitness accounts and official records and documents. But even given his critical disposition, Tacitus nevertheless records various legends and myths that were common in the cultural milieu of antiquity. He records various omens and supernatural portents as tied to events in the life of Emperor Nero. He also reports the appearance of a phoenix in Egypt during Tiberius's reign and described it as a rare bird associated with mythical rebirth cycles. Thus, again, we see that a generally reliable and critical historian can still fall victim to recording and promulgating that which is not historically accurate. I could belabor this point with a multitude of examples, but hopefully the contention is understood. Let's revisit David's claim in order to revisit the fallacy that he's promoting.
How would we know if Jesus was alive at some point following his execution by the Romans? The same way we know many other things from history. We need witnesses, and we need to know that we can trust these witnesses.
So hopefully it's apparent why David's reasoning here is not sound. We cannot simply know that event X happened merely because we're told it happened by a trustworthy and reliable source. There are other important factors at play, especially with regards to an event like Jesus' resurrection. And some of these important factors can be things such as the prior probability of event X, the existence of factors that might inhibit the otherwise reliable nature of the sources, the facts surrounding how our sources came to know of event X, and how their testimony and beliefs regarding event X were shaped by psychological factors and cultural anthropology, and how their relaying of their remembrance of event X was shaped by their culture, beliefs, and biases. These are all carefully intertwined sociological factors that are not easily answered by a blanket statement about the supposed reliability of the sources. And on top of that, this is all assuming that the narrative traditions we have of Jesus' resurrection are indeed from eyewitnesses and are from eyewitnesses who are the pinnacle of trustworthiness. And neither of those are propositions that I would grant. And this is where David turns his attention to next.
Do we have witnesses of the risen Jesus? Yes, lots. Fortunately, they began preaching almost immediately, and we have summaries of some of their early sermons. They issued official creedal statements that could be easily memorized and passed on to others. They sent out representatives with authoritative traditions that would eventually be incorporated into the Gospels and other writings.
Whoa there. David has just successfully performed a bait and switch. In the earlier clip we surveyed, David articulated that we could know a historical event took place if we have reliable sources and eyewitnesses that attest to it. This was false, but nevertheless, this was his claim. But in this clip, he's just admitted that we don't actually have these original eyewitness sources to begin with. As David just said, the accounts of the original eyewitness sources are, quote, summarized through early sermons and creedal statements that were, quote, passed on, and authoritative traditions that were, quote, eventually incorporated into the Gospels. So contrary to what David originally articulated, we don't actually have first-hand accounts of these supposedly reliable and trustworthy sources, which of course begs the question of how David knows these original sources were reliable and trustworthy to begin with. No, what we have are sermons, creeds, and traditions that filtered through various other sources and mediums before eventually being written down decades later by individuals who were not first-hand witnesses to the events in question. David's case is becoming flimsier by the minute.
But the most interesting source on the eyewitnesses of the risen Jesus is an early Christian creed recorded in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-7. 1 Corinthians was written around AD 55, and Paul says in the letter that he had already delivered the creed to the church in Corinth which would have been around AD 51. But Paul received the creed long before that, either when he visited the apostles in Jerusalem or perhaps even at his conversion. And scholars date its formulation to within a few years of Jesus' crucifixion.
So notice that for David, the quote, most interesting source that attests to Jesus' resurrection is Paul, someone who was not an eyewitness and is only passing on a creed, not even a narrative testimony of an eyewitness, but a creed of a tradition that preceded him. How does any of this tie into David's original claim about reliable and trustworthy eyewitnesses being the very things that allow us to infer the veracity of historical claims? Why then, according to David, is the resurrection's, quote, most interesting source a source that satisfies none of those criteria? With that being said, let's see how David attempts to use the creed in 1 Corinthians 15 to bolster his case.
Notice what we have here. We have Jesus' death for sins, his burial, his resurrection on the third day, and numerous appearances. And we have all of it as authoritative tradition within a few years, if not within months, of the crucifixion. As for the appearances, there are appearances to individuals, Peter, James, the brother of Jesus, and eventually Paul, to small groups, the 12 and all the apostles, and to a large group. He appeared to more than 500. The list also reports appearances to both friends and foes. Peter and the apostles were followers of Jesus during his 3-year ministry, but James and Paul weren't. James didn't believe that his brother was the Messiah when Jesus was preaching in Galilee and Judea, and Paul persecuted the church and tried to destroy it. Yet they're all listed as witnesses who saw Jesus alive again sometime after his death. This passage eliminates 2 skeptical responses to Jesus' resurrection, the legend hypothesis and the hallucination hypothesis. At the internet level, there are still people who claim that Christian belief in Jesus' resurrection arose through a process of legendary development over a period of many decades. But this is factually false. We know, as a fact of history, that the resurrection was the heart of Christian preaching from the beginning.
Apparently, David is not well versed in anthropology. He seems to believe that if a creedal tradition can be traced to not long after the events the creed supposedly relays, then no legendary development could have possibly accrued. This is demonstrably false. We know of a plethora of cases throughout history of legends sprouting up literally from one day to the next. And we even have instances of legends completely saturating the accounts of historical figures while those figures were yet still alive. For anyone interested in specific examples of rapid legendary development of this sort, consult my video entitled Did Legend Corrupt the Gospel Accounts of Jesus?, which I'll link to in the description. So, contrary to David's naive beliefs regarding cultural anthropology, the existence of the creed in 1 Corinthians 15 does not at all, quote, eliminate the skeptical response tied to legendary development. Legends could have begun forming in the very early hours of Easter morning, especially given that during this time, the followers of Jesus would have all been highly suggestible and more easily susceptible to social contagion, groupthink, and group-enforced confirmation bias. Legends could have begun or continued to accrue during the subsequent days as the stories and beliefs regarding encounters with the risen Jesus began to widely circulate. And again, during this time, the followers of Jesus would still be breeding grounds for various social psychological phenomena. Legends could have begun or continued to accrue in the coming months as the outline of a resurrection tradition began to take hold through the memories of those early followers. And during this time, various biases of memory such as confirmation bias, collaborative inhibition, memory conformity, hindsight bias, and source misattribution could have radically altered the collective memories of what transpired on Easter Sunday and caused legend to overshadow history. At any of these different stages of the formulation of the resurrection tradition just mentioned, legend could have effortlessly taken hold and started growing due to these social psychological factors. Or, quite plausibly, as already articulated, the legends began on Easter Sunday and accumulated at each moment thereafter. Again, we know from cultural anthropology that these things are plausible, especially regarding a religious movement centered around a charismatic apocalyptic leader who was just brutally killed. You almost couldn't manufacture a better breeding ground for social contagion and group enforced biases if you tried. So David is simply incorrect to think that a few verses in a letter from the Apostle Paul can somehow eliminate in one fell swoop the very plausible possibility that legendary development significantly contributed to the resurrection tradition. And if David's case against the accumulation of legend is this poor, one wonders if his case against the possibility of hallucinations will fare any better.
You also may have heard people argue that Jesus' disciples simply hallucinated the resurrection appearances. But a hallucination, by definition, is something that occurs in the mind of the person experiencing it. If you take a bunch of acid and a leprechaun appears to you, the rest of us aren't going to ask him for his pot of gold because we won't see him. He won't exist outside your acid-tripping mind. But Jesus appeared to entire groups on multiple occasions, and hallucinations just can't explain repeated group appearances.
David's strange acid trip analogy aside, he's once again overlooking critical nuances when it comes to the hallucination hypothesis. First, I've never heard a skeptic claim that all the supposed group appearances are explainable in terms of hallucinations. If skeptics actually believed that 500 people claimed to see Jesus at once, this would indeed be more difficult, though not at all impossible, to account for as a collective hallucination. But most skeptics don't grant this, as the evidence for it is scant. Rather, most skeptics, such as myself, need only posit a possible scenario wherein a small handful of hallucinations took place, possibly with regards to Peter and Mary, let us say, and that this, as already mentioned, sparked social contagion and groupthink, which eventually led to legendary stories about group appearances. However, even if we do allow for the fact that large multitudes believed they saw Jesus again after he died, the group hallucination hypothesis is not as implausible as it appears on first glance. First, the notion of, quote, group hallucination seems, as used by Christian apologists, to invoke a narrow psychological condition that doesn't really account for the breadth of psychological phenomena wherein large groups of people can be collectively deceived. Are the groups of individuals who collectively and genuinely believe they've been abducted by extraterrestrials not suffering some sort of mass deception that would at least approach what we would refer to as a group hallucination? Was the entire 17th century town of Salem, Massachusetts, which suffered a textbook case of mass hysteria based on their perceptions of witchcraft, not suffering some sort of collective mass delusion that would, again, approach at least a rough parallel with group hallucinations? Were the tens of thousands of people who witnessed the sun dance and zigzag in the sky in Fatima, Portugal in 1917 not suffering from some type of collective psychological phenomena? Especially since we know without a doubt that the sun never moves relative to us on Earth. Whether one wants to label these as instances of group hallucinations or not, what we have here are clear instances of mass delusion and deception. And there's dozens more cases like this all throughout history. People in groups are just as susceptible as individuals to psychological delusion. How exactly can we rule something like this out in the case of the appearances of the resurrected Jesus? And how exactly would the Creed in 1 Corinthians 15 accomplish this? Because the Creed is early, a mass psychological delusion couldn't have occurred early on in the supposed experience of the risen Jesus? That does not follow at all. Couple this with the fact that the resurrection accounts themselves are mired in obscurity and ambiguity, and a hypothesis of mass delusion certainly gains traction. Why, for instance, in so many different narratives where Jesus appears, did people doubt? In Matthew, Luke, and John, we have some doubting what they're seeing with regards to Jesus appearing to them. We also have multiple cases where disciples and Mary don't realize that Jesus is right in front of them. They converse with him and still don't realize they're talking to the post-mortem Jesus. Why? We don't exactly know. What we do know, though, is that even in the cases we just surveyed of mass delusion, some individuals doubt, or some individuals don't exactly see what everyone else is seeing. So, contrary to David's dismissive attitude regarding group hallucinations, this type of psychological phenomena is not so easily cast aside as a possible hypothesis that at least partially explains widespread belief in Jesus' resurrection. And David certainly has not done the intellectual legwork required to call this hypothesis into question. David subsequently considers the hypothesis that the disciples were merely lying about their belief in Jesus' resurrection, and correctly, in my opinion, dismisses it. I agree with David that it's likely the disciples genuinely believed they had witnessed the risen Jesus. However, from this proposition, David makes such an incredible leap of logical inference that I guarantee there's no way he sticks the landing.
Paula Fredrickson, I know in their own terms what they saw was the raised Jesus. I'm not saying that they really did see the raised Jesus. I wasn't there. I don't know what they saw. But I do know, as a historian, that they must have seen something. Fredrickson says that she doesn't know what they saw. But I do. I think it's obvious what they saw. The disciples saw the sort of thing that would convince individuals and groups, friends and foes, that they had all seen a man who had been dead, alive again, standing in front of them, telling them why he had to die and rise again. Unfortunately for our atheist friends, the only sort of thing that can do that is Jesus actually appearing to them, which means that Jesus rose from the dead.
Wow. David must never have been introduced to the notion of intellectual humility. Even the most well-known scholars and apologists who argue for the resurrection will usually not make such incredibly grandiose assertions. They will no doubt argue that the resurrection is by far the most probable hypothesis that explains all the facts in a superior fashion, but I've never heard a Christian apologist claim that they indubitably know exactly what the disciples saw. And rarely have I heard them articulate that the only possible explanation is that Jesus rose from the dead. How can David possibly know what he claims to know? How can he know that the only sort of thing that would possibly convince individuals and groups that they had seen Jesus resurrected was in fact a resurrected Jesus? The answer is he can't. In fact, we can easily disprove David's epistemic hubris using the Gospels themselves, since according to both the Gospels of Mark and Matthew, at some point in Jesus' ministry, some believed Jesus to be John the Baptist resurrected from the dead. In fact, Herod Antipas himself is said to have remarked, upon hearing reports of Jesus' ministry, that Jesus was John the Baptist resurrected. Is David prepared to double down on his inference and affirm that the only sort of thing that would possibly convince individuals and groups that they had seen John the Baptist resurrected was indeed a resurrected John the Baptist? I highly doubt it. There's simply no epistemic avenue for David to ground such a ridiculous inference. Is an actual veridical encounter with extraterrestrials the only sort of thing that would convince individuals and groups that they have encountered extraterrestrials? Is an actual veridical encounter with witchcraft the only sort of thing that would convince the 17th century town of Salem, Massachusetts that they had encountered witchcraft? Is an actual veridical astronomical event the only sort of thing that would convince tens of thousands of people in Fatima, Portugal, that they had encountered a supernatural astronomical event? For anyone who studied even a minutia of social psychology and cultural anthropology, the answer to these questions is an emphatic no. As already articulated, people, especially large groups of people, can, through various psychological biases and blind spots, become deceptively convinced of a phenomenon that does not objectively exist, or can misinterpret and twist what does exist into something that doesn't. Either David simply doesn't understand this, in which case he's grossly misinformed and should not be making historical inferences of the type he's making, or else he does understand this and is merely engaging in special pleading. Either way, David's arguments here are hopelessly fallacious, and his certainty is completely unfounded. At this point, David doesn't really have much else to offer in this video on the resurrection. His last point that I feel the need to comment on is regarding atheists' supposed pre-commitment to naturalism.
So, there's only one conclusion to draw from the facts that even atheist and agnostic scholars grant as historically certain. And yet, atheist and agnostic scholars clearly don't believe that Jesus rose from the dead. Why do they reject the resurrection when they're aware of the historical evidence? Different people will give different reasons for denying Jesus' resurrection, but if you do a little digging, two broad issues emerge most frequently. First, many people have a prior commitment to naturalism. Supernatural explanations are ruled out before the investigation begins. And if supernatural explanations are ruled out beforehand, Jesus' resurrection is never even a candidate for belief.
I'm not going to devote much time arguing against the notion that many atheists have a commitment to naturalism. Surely many do. How many? The majority? Maybe. I don't know. Nevertheless, one needn't be an atheist, and one needn't hold to an a priori metaphysical naturalism in order to doubt the, quote, evidence that David has promulgated. I myself am not an atheist, nor am I a naturalist, and yet it's been effortless to poke holes in David's weak arguments and inferences. That being said, everyone approaches evidence with biases. An atheist might have a bias tilted towards naturalism, but surely the Christian has just as significant a bias that tilts their perception of the weight of the evidence towards that which already affirms their Christian faith. After all, no Christian will likely give up their belief in the resurrection without simultaneously giving up their faith as well. Is this not what the Apostle Paul himself preached? How likely, then, is it that the Christian will approach the evidence for the resurrection dispassionately and even-handed, given that the potential for denying the resurrection would be disastrous to their worldview? Atheists certainly don't have a monopoly on biases. It appears that it would be best, then, for David to leave talk of potential biases to the side. What matters in the end is the arguments and the evidence itself. And unfortunately for David, this is where he comes up short. The cumulative case he's put together here is most assuredly one of the weakest I've ever surveyed. His defense fails to withstand even the slightest sense of rigorous scrutiny. David shies away from any nuance, any qualification, or intellectual humility when it comes to his perception of the evidence. His rhetorical reach exceeds his inferential grasp, and will only resonate with those already predisposed to his conclusions. Ultimately, a balanced evaluation of the evidence demands greater caution, humility, and engagement with the full scope of historical and psychological possibilities, qualities conspicuously absent in David's approach. Thanks for watching.